Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really get into the nitty-gritty of some fascinating sources.
Right.
Today, we're looking at something pretty unsettling, actually. It's all around us, but invisible. The air we breathe, especially indoors. In places we usually think are safe. We've got some recent observations, expert insights, and they paint a stark picture. So our mission today, it's to unpack this idea, which sounds, frankly, a bit extreme at first. The idea that our modern closed buildings, they might be acting like gas chambers, and that we might be the ones cleaning the air, becoming human air purifiers. A lot to take in, so let's dive into why these sources use such strong language.
It is strong language, and yeah, pretty disturbing when you first hear it, but it comes from some really direct sort of visceral experiences. Like one of the sources talks about the author walking into two different buildings, closed environments, right? And within minutes, literally minutes, their nose gets completely congested, blocked up fast.
Wow, that quick.
Yeah, really fast. And it wasn't just a one-off. Happened both times. And this was totally different from their experience in what they call a human paradise somewhere with, obviously much better air. So that immediate physical reaction, that's what really kicked off this whole investigation into what on earth is actually in the air inside.
Okay, let's unpack that then. That immediate reaction, congestion in minutes. What is making the air so bad in these closed spaces?
Right. So the sources point to a few key things stacking up. First off, just basic poor air circulation. A lot of central AC systems, especially in big buildings, they mostly just recirculate the air that's already inside.
Not bringing in enough fresh air.
Exactly. So you get this continuous buildup, co-euros, dust, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, we can get into those, and especially these ultrafine particles. They just keep concentrating because they have nowhere else to go.
Okay, VOCs and ultrafine particles.
Yeah.
You mentioned PM 0.1.
Yes, PM 0.1. And even smaller stuff. These are particles that are just incredibly tiny, like 0.1 micrometers.
It's hard to even picture how small that is.
It really is. Think maybe 1,000 times smaller than a hair's width. And because they're so small, they get past our natural defenses, deep into the nasal passages, deep into the lungs, down to the alveoli, the little air sacs. That's what triggers that immediate inflammation, the swelling, the congestion. Sometimes, like the author found, it happens really, really fast.
Okay, so the particles themselves are a big part. What else?
Well, the air conditioning itself can make things worse. Not just the circulation, but the conditions it creates. It often dries the air out, right? And you get these sharp temperature shifts. Plus, it speeds up moisture evaporating from your own nasal passages, your mucosa. That just makes any swelling feel worse.
Right, that dry, scratchy feeling you sometimes get.
Exactly. And then, layered on top of all that are the chemical irritants. Odors, fumes. Think about everything indoors. Building materials, new furniture, carpets, cleaning sprays, air fresheners, perfume.
All giving off chemicals.
Constantly. Things like formaldehyde, benzene, stuff you don't want to be breathing. And the sources suggest our noses react almost like a defense mechanism, trying to shut down to protect us, which adds to that feeling of being blocked up.
Wow. Okay, so it's a real cocktail of problems hitting you all at once. But here's something from the sources that really struck me. Not everyone feels it immediately, and that might actually be the bigger danger. Can you explain these sort of dual-level hazards?
Yeah, this is a really crucial point the sources make. It's quite insightful, actually. They basically describe two groups of people based on how they react. First, you've got the symptomatic people, like the author, maybe people with allergies. They react fast, congestion, sneezing, runny nose, all the signs. And in a way, the sources say these people are kind of the lucky ones. They have a built-in warning system. Their body is screaming, hey, this air is toxic.
An immediate alarm bell.
Precisely. But then there's the second group,
Yeah.
the asymptomatic individuals. These are the people who walk into the same room and feel, well, fine, no immediate reaction, no allergies flaring up.
But they're still breathing the same air.
Exactly. And that's the scary part. The toxins are still getting in, still being absorbed day in, day out, silently. For these people, the problems only show up later, much later, when their body hits what the sources call a toxin saturation point.
Saturation point. And what happens then?
That's when you might see chronic diseases emerging, organ damage, even potentially cancer. So the lack of an immediate reaction doesn't mean you're safe. It just means the damage is accumulating quietly. It's a kind of silent poisoning.
That is.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's really unsettling, this idea of silent accumulation. And the sources mentioned visible long-term effects too, right? Things you could actually see in people's appearance.
Yes, they did, connecting that long-term exposure to actual physical changes. The author mentions observing office workers, people spending hours every day in these environments, and describing their complexions as often yellowish, sallow, or pale gray.
Not just looking tired, but unhealthy.
Exactly. Presented as visible signs of this long-term toxic buildup. Things like reduced oxygen in the blood, metabolic waste accumulating, poor microcirculation. It all affects the skin, leading to that dullness, maybe even pigmentation spots.
Mm.
The sources really hammer this point home, calling closed offices high-risk zones. You're just sitting there, inhaling the same polluted air for 8, 9, 10 hours a day.
With very little chance for your body to clear it out.
Right, and it suggests that maybe that sort of generally poor complexion we sometimes associate with city dwellers isn't just from outdoor pollution, it's this indoor factor too, maybe even more so.
Okay, so we started with closed buildings, offices,
Mhm.
and that's already quite alarming. But the sources broaden the scope, don't they? They talk about air toxins being a much more ubiquitous threat, like everywhere. You might think, okay, I'll just step outside for fresh air, but is it really fresh out there?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources suggest maybe not as fresh as we'd hope. It's useful to think about indoor versus outdoor sources and how they kind of merge together. Indoors, we've already touched on some culprits. VOCs from inside your car, fumes from cooking. Then there's human dander, pet dander, formaldehyde still leaching from furniture, decor, artificial fragrances and soaps, lotions, cleaners.
Even things meant to help, like air purifier.
Sometimes, yeah. Some might produce ozone. And central AC, if not maintained, can circulate mold or tiny toxic particles. None of this causes you to collapse right away, usually, but it adds up, slowly pushing you towards that toxin saturation point.
Okay, so that's indoors. What about outside?
Outside isn't necessarily a safe haven, especially in urban areas. You've got vehicle exhaust, obviously, but also brake dust, tiny bits of tires, microplastics floating around, particles from construction sites, PM 2.5, which people hear about, but also that PM 0.1 again, and heavy metals.
So much particulate matter.
Yes. Plus factory emissions, sometimes acidic mist, these tiny sub-micron aerosols. Even pollen can be coated with pesticides. Again, it's those PM 0.1 particles and the even smaller nanoparticles that are particularly worrying. They're so small they can potentially get everywhere in the body.
Yeah.
Into the bloodstream, maybe even crossing the blood-brain barrier, reaching the core of our cells.
Wow.
The sources suggest they could even potentially alter cell fate. Yeah, it highlights how pervasive and invasive these tiny things are.
So if inside is bad and outside is also bad,
Yeah.
this leads to what the sources call that absurd excuse.
Exactly, the absurd excuse for not opening windows.
Mm-hmm.
Someone feels the indoor air is stuffy or bad, but they think, oh, but the air outside is even dirtier, so I'll keep everything sealed up.
Which just traps everything inside even more.
Precisely. And this, according to the sources, leads to this tragedy of urban populations worldwide. Humans as air purifiers. Because you're sealed in, you end up absorbing and storing a higher proportion of the indoor toxins than you might from just being outside briefly. There's no escape, no dilution. Your body becomes the filter.
Humans as air purifiers. That phrase is just chilling. Okay, so if the air is this problematic, both indoors and out, what about technology? Filters, air purifiers. Surely they help. What do the sources say about the true bottleneck here? Are there any systems that actually make a real difference, or is it universally flawed?
This is where the sources get quite critical of current common technology. They point to a major failing, particularly with HEPA filters.
HEPA. But isn't that the standard? The good stuff.
It is the standard, and it's good for larger particles, dust, pollen, mold spores, things like that. But HEPA filters are primarily designed and rated for particles that are 0.3 micrometers in size or bigger,
Okay.
which means those truly deadly ultrafine particles, we talked about the PM 0.1 and smaller, they go right through completely. HEPA filters are essentially ineffective against many of the most dangerous airborne toxins in buildings.
So the thing we rely on for protection doesn't actually protect against the worst threats.
That's the core insight the sources are putting forward. What we think is protecting us often isn't, at least not fully.
Huh. Okay. What about fresh air systems then? Bringing air from outside?
Well, unless they have incredibly sophisticated multi-stage filtration specifically targeting those ultrafine particles, which most don't, they can just end up importing the outdoor pollutants we just discussed, unchanged.
So you're just swapping one set of problems for another.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And if the system is mostly recirculating air, even if it passes through a HEPA filter, those ultrafines and VOCs just keep going round and around. It becomes a kind of pollution merry-go-round.
And the VOCs,
Mm.
the chemical fumes.
Right. Formaldehyde, benzene, perfumes, cleaning agents. The sources emphasize there's basically no effective filter for those in most standard systems. So where do they go? They get absorbed through our lungs, our nasal passages, even our skin. Which brings us back to that stark image. We become the human air purifiers, filtering the building's air with our own bodies.
That's deeply concerning. Does the sources explain why HEPA fails so badly with these nanoparticles?
They do go into a bit more detail, yeah. Several reasons. One is airflow speed. In many systems, the air moves too fast across the filter for the finer particles to actually get trapped effectively through adsorption sticking to the material.
They just zip past?
Kinda, yeah. Another issue is the electrostatic charge some filters use to help grab particles. That charge can apparently degrade pretty quickly, sometimes in weeks, making the filter much less effective over time. And fundamentally, they often lack the really complex, dense structures the sources call labyrinth structures that are needed to physically block or electrostatically trap these incredibly tiny particles through processes like inertial impaction.
Okay, so multiple failure points for the smallest, most dangerous stuff. Which leads to another disturbing idea you mentioned, that the filters we do have might not just be inadequate, but could actually create more problems, this secondary pollution trap.
Yes, exactly. It builds on this idea of the high-pressure toxin chamber effect. Think about being sealed inside that building, that gas chamber, as the sources call it. Why is the concentration often higher inside than outside? One reason is what they term the 100% absorption effect. Pollutants released inside have nowhere to go. They don't disperse into the atmosphere. They basically all end up getting absorbed by the occupants.
No escape route.
None. Then there's extreme accumulation efficiency. Without fresh air diluting things, almost all the ultrafine particles just settle into people's bodies. And this leads to accelerated saturation. The sources estimate that the level of toxic buildup that might take, say, 40 years living with typical outdoor exposure could happen in just 20 or 30 years inside these sealed buildings.
Bringing forward the timeline for health problems.
Yeah.
Organ failure.
Exactly. It really frames it as a significantly higher risk environment over the long term.
Okay, and the secondary pollution part. How do filters add to that?
Right, the secondary pollution trap of filters. So even when a filter does manage to catch some particles, they aren't necessarily removed permanently. Imagine the filter getting loaded up. Then strong airflow, or maybe even just vibrations or particles bumping into each other, can dislodge some of those trapped pollutants.
So they get knocked loose and blown back into the room.
Precisely. They re-enter the air circulation. The filter itself becomes a source of pollution. The author mentions their own experience, having a HEPA-based fresh air system for the whole house, but still finding that the filters in individual room purifiers got dirty really quickly.
Which suggests stuff is still getting through or getting re-released.
Yeah. It's not just settling dust. The sources frame it as evidence of this vicious cycle of deposition and re-release. The filters act more like temporary holding pens than permanent removal vaults.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, taking a deep dive into this invisible challenge, the air we breathe, especially in these modern closed spaces we spend so much time in. And it really seems clear from these sources that our basic assumptions, about being safe indoors, about filters protecting us, they might be seriously flawed, turning the places we think of as refuge into these high-pressure toxin chambers without us even realizing it.
It definitely forces a rethink, doesn't it? It makes you question the technology we rely on. Current systems often just fall short, especially against these really insidious ultrafine toxins. And the sources really point towards needing something more advanced. Filtration tech that can actually truly intercept the finest, most toxic killers, going way beyond what HEPA filters can do today. It's about seeing the invisible threats that our current defenses are, essentially blind to.
So for you listening, here's the provocative thought to leave you with, based on everything we've unpacked today. If our everyday places, offices, cars, maybe even our homes, can be described by these sources as high-pressure toxin chambers, and if we are, unknowingly, acting as human air purifiers, what can we actually do about it? And what kind of future technologies might finally give us genuinely clear, clean air to breathe? What stands out most to you from learning about the air you're likely breathing right now?